Hello, I'm Dr. Ken Landau. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be concluding our discussion of hepatitis C. We now will discuss how we make the diagnosis and then, of course, how we treat the disorder. You have to realize that the overwhelming majority of people with hepatitis C not going to have any symptoms, and there's a question of whether the majority of people need any kind of therapy. But we have the therapy available, and if you listen to all of the talk going on in the media right now, it would sound as if everybody who's infected needs some kind of therapy, but that might not be the case, especially when the therapy costs well in excess of $100,000 an individual, and it's estimated that there are somewhere between 2.5 million and 3 million infected individuals here in the United States, and then somewhere between 60 million and 170 million people throughout the world. Well, how do we make the diagnosis? We do it on a blood test. The blood test might be a screening blood test that's done just as a routine screen when you go and see your doctor for your annual visit, or maybe you have some other kind of condition that affects the liver and you have a blood test, or maybe because you have a routine screening test, part of your yearly physical, just checking your liver just as we check your blood sugar and check your kidney function. Well, we might find that one test is abnormal, and if it's abnormal, then you go on the line to find out whether you have an infection with the virus. Just because the antibody is positive, just because the screening blood test shows that you have antibodies against the hepatitis B virus, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have an active infection, because remember we said that a significant number of people, maybe 25% of the people infected with the virus, are going to spontaneously clear the virus, and if you clear the virus, chances are that antibody is going to stay with you for decades, or in some cases, it's a sign that you do have an infection. Well, how do we make the diagnosis of a current infection? If the antibody test only says you were infected at some point in time, now we do a viral test. We specifically look at the RNA. Remember, we said it's an RNA-containing virus, and we do a test. Now, this test becomes positive in a very short period of time. It becomes positive usually within a couple weeks after infection. It might be delayed for 6 or 7 or 8 weeks, but usually comes positive very quickly. We can do two kinds of tests for the virus itself. We can do a qualitative test just to see if it's there, or we could do a quantitative test. A quantitative test tells us how much virus is present. Now, knowing how much virus is present sounds like it ought to be an important thing, but it really isn't. We just really want to know, is the virus there or isn't it there? We know that it fluctuates significantly during the course of time, and we know that the treatment and the success of the treatment really doesn't seem to have much to do with the level of the virus. Now, the virus is kind of unstable, so once you have your blood drawn, it has to be either tested right away or frozen right away. We have all sorts of fancy tests that we can do. But let's say we've determined that you have the viral infection. Now, just because you have the viral infection doesn't necessarily mean that you have any kind of a problem. Now, what should we do? Well, in the old days, it was said that everybody, especially those people who were considering some kind of therapy, and the therapy in those days was pegylated interferon and ribavirin, it was said that anybody who was considering therapy ought to have a biopsy of the liver. Biopsy for the liver that would tell us whether you really had problems in your liver or whether you were too far advanced, because we know that those people who had advanced disease who were given treatment wouldn't do very well. But unfortunately, there's a small risk, but it's a real risk of complications of the liver biopsy. And it probably isn't a test that everyone needs, and as a matter of fact, is a test that the overwhelming majority of people probably wouldn't have done. So, how do we rate the liver biopsy? Well, we rate the liver biopsy on simple evaluation. We find out if there's any scarring. If there's no scarring, that's great. So you're a candidate for just actually watching. If there's some kind of scarring, we can grade the scarring depending on where it is, whether it's in the portal tract or whether it's spread from the portal tract. Those are obviously important distinctions, and a good pathologist has to make those. But unfortunately, there's significant inter-individual observational differences. In other words, if you look at, or if you give a slide to the pathologist and ask him to evaluate what he sees, well, unfortunately, oftentimes tends not to agree with what some other pathologist happens to say. So there's a liver test is not only potentially dangerous, it's very expensive, it can cause some pain. Now we have the interpretation of the biopsy is subject to controversy, to discussion, to disagreement. And then we have some kind of other complications. So we stick a needle in the liver, and boy, the liver can certainly bleed. It can cause significant organ damage and can cause death in a very small number of people. Well, one of the other tests that we can do is known as an ALT. An ALT is a very common test. It's on most routine blood panels, and this test is a test to determine inflammation in the liver, liver cell function. We know that the test typically is positive in people who have hepatitis C, but it's not specific for hepatitis C, and as a matter of fact, it can even be normal if you have hepatitis C. It can fluctuate. It can be normal sometime, abnormal sometime. It certainly does not, one measurement doesn't rule out an active infection. It doesn't tell us whether you're going to have progression, and as a matter of fact, it doesn't even tell us whether you have cirrhosis of the liver. It's also very important to realize that when you're under treatment and the ALT gets back to normal, it doesn't tell us that your liver is normal. And unfortunately, it also, if it stays abnormal, doesn't tell us that hepatitis C is the reason that you have a problem. Well, we can also do some other tests. We can test the AST, which is another kind of liver enzyme, and compare it to the platelet count. We can do a test of other functions for the liver. We know that the liver is important in manufacturing those factors that cause coagulation, so we can test some coagulation time. The liver makes protein, so we can test the albumin, which is a type of protein. There's another kind of a test known as FibroSure. What it does is it looks at a variety of different chemicals that the liver makes or manufactures or has to do with, and then through this FibroSure, which is a blood evaluation, we can get a good idea as to what's happening. But there's another test that was only recently approved in the United States, approved in mid-2013, and this test is known as the FibroScan. And the FibroScan tests the amount of fibrosis or scarring in the liver. It's a test that's moderately expensive, but it seems to be more accurate than most tests, and probably either the FibroScan or the FibroSure will eliminate need for the liver biopsy. If a person opts not to have treatment but has some kind of abnormality, it might be appropriate to do some sort of periodic monitoring of the individual. Certainly in those people who have more advanced disease, ultrasound might be appropriate. We don't screen with alpha-fetoprotein like we used to do. If a person is lucky, the person can clear the virus spontaneously, but the overwhelming majority of people cannot clear the virus and then go on to develop persistent disease that may be symptomatic or may not be symptomatic. Well, what we know is we have a goal of therapy, and the goal of therapy, if we so opt for therapy, is to eradicate the virus. And what we would like to do is eradicate the virus to prevent certain kind of complications and reduce the risk of cirrhosis or liver cancer or end-stage liver disease. We'd like to reduce the likelihood that a person is going to transmit the infection to a loved one or to somebody else. We would like to normalize the liver functions. We would like to improve the look of the liver, and we would like to overall make certain that the disease is stopped in its tracks. Well, that can be done with certain of our new therapies, but you have to realize that elimination of the virus doesn't necessarily mean resumption of normal. We don't know that those people who have the liver virus eradicated get back to normal. And there's another issue. Even though we monitor successive therapy by talking about what the SVR, sustained viral response, is after therapy, either 12 weeks after therapy or 24 weeks after therapy, we don't know that that really is a good marker. And as a matter of fact, we know that you can have significant disease and have eradication of the virus. And we also know that eradication of the virus may well only tell us that the person was in better health. that the person had some other kind of issue that allowed that person to clear the virus, and it really had nothing to do with the amount of disease that was going on in the liver. Now, it's also important that if you have infection with hepatitis C, you do some things that seem to make sense. So if you have hepatitis C, don't be a heavy drinker. Actually, don't even be a moderate drinker. We know if you inflame your liver, if you irritate your liver, then that's going to make the hepatitis C progress. We also know you have to be careful about some kind of toxic drugs. You ought to avoid taking excessive amounts of acetaminophen. You got to be careful about the amount of sodium you consume, especially if you have more advanced liver disease. We know that if you have hepatitis C, you ought to be immunized against hepatitis B and hepatitis A. If you haven't already been immunized, if you have cirrhosis, you ought to have the pneumonia vaccine, the flu vaccine. That's a given. You should get that. We know you want to avoid some of the hepatotoxic herbs. We see a lot of people who are taking vitamins and minerals to excess. They take all of these natural supplements, and we know some of the natural supplements can actually irritate the liver, make hepatitis C worse. So we know that you should stay away from pennyroyal, you should stay away from mistletoe and leaf germander. We know that chaparral is bad for you. It doesn't seem to make any difference whether you have milk thistle or not. It doesn't seem to help, doesn't seem to hurt. Now, we have a significant number of medicines that are in the development stages, but fortunately, since our medicines at the present time are so good, it probably is going to be met with a reduction in the number of medicines in the pipeline. Reduction because the therapy right now with current therapies from Gilead Corporation are extremely good. The question is, do you need treatment? And that's an issue that we don't have an answer for. We know that those people who have advanced disease absolutely need treatment, but the overwhelming majority of people, if they're going to live 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years without any kind of symptoms, we know that we can't improve them terribly if they're otherwise healthy and if they don't have any kind of problems. We know the sustained viral response, if we get rid of the virus, well, theoretically, we can reduce your all-cause mortality. But on the studies, looking at people over a long period of time, it doesn't seem that those people infected with the hepatitis C virus have any different long-term potential than the people who are not infected, unless there is a particular problem. And as I mentioned before, it seems that the people in whom we can eliminate the virus, those people might have a better natural history anyway, so it might not be really important that we get rid of the virus. So who do we treat? Well, we like to treat those people. Obviously, you have to have the virus in order to get the treatment. And we like to have the people who maybe have some sort of fibrosis or estimation that there's some kind of at least a mild or a moderate inflammation of the liver and that it's progressive. Now, if you just have an elevation of the ALT, but we find on examination you only have minimal, or maybe you don't even have any necrosis or inflammation of the liver, well, you're probably in that in-between zone, and you probably don't need a lot of intervention, but you can't argue. On the other hand, in those people who don't have any fibrosis, who have a normal ALT, and those people who don't have any histologic evidence or any evidence on any of our tests of ongoing inflammation or significant disease of the liver, well, we can say for those people, and it's probably there in the majority of people, well, we really don't need any kind of treatment. Well, what kind of treatment should you get if you have hepatitis C? That's a major issue, and it's an issue that we don't have control over. Actually, the people that have control over it are the insurance plans. The insurance plans sort of determine whether you're going to get treatment, whether you're not going to get treatment. And there's a lot of hanky-panky or a lot of issues that have nothing to do with health care, that have to do with whether you should receive the medicine and which medicine that the insurance company is going to say you can receive. So certain of the pharmacy benefit managers pick one drug or they pick another drug. The insurance coverage is positive for one or not for another. And as a matter of fact, we know that at the present time, there is significant negotiations going on between the drug manufacturers and the insurance companies that once upon a time restricted treatment to those people with more advanced disease, but now in order to get a discount, they're saying, well, we'll treat a lot more people, so that the drug company, even though the drug company is going to sell the medicines at a reduced cost, it's going to sell a lot more of the medicine. Well, what are our therapies? We didn't have any therapy up until about 1989. 1989, interferon came into vogue. There was first patient treated in 1989, and then in the 1990s, interferon first by itself came into treatment. We used that. But unfortunately, the sustained viral response, the likelihood of a good response to interferon was less than 20%. Later on, we added some ribavirin. That increased the response rate to about 40%. In the 2000s, we changed the formulation of the interferon from the standard interferon to what we call pegylated interferon, where we put some polyethylene glycol, a chemical, on the interferon molecule, and it stayed in the system for a longer period of time, so we didn't have to give it as much, and it seemed to work a heck of a lot better. And then the likelihood of a sustained viral response with therapy with interferon and ribavirin, the pegylated type of interferon, increased to slightly in excess of 50%. At least for genotype 1, the common kind here in the United States. It was higher, anywhere between 70 and 90% for genotypes 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 that are not typically present in the United States. The duration of the therapy was very long, so people who received the interferon and the ribavirin oftentimes had to be on therapy for a year. We would consider a variety of factors to decide who was going to get therapy, but unfortunately these therapies had an awful lot of side effects and an awful lot of contraindications, so a lot of people couldn't even get the therapy. Those people most in need of therapy couldn't get the therapy. So we know that people cannot get the interferon therapy if they had psychiatric disease, if they had severe depression, or if they had previously tried to commit suicide, or people who had abnormal blood count, low white count, low platelet count, symptomatic heart disease, people who had decompensated cirrhosis of the liver, people who had a history of seizures or organ transplants. The people who seemed to need potentially the most, they were unable to receive because of complications. And also people with autoimmune disease like thyroid disease and uncontrolled diabetes couldn't get it. Same sort of story with ribavirin. Lots of people had problems with the drug. We know that those people who had severe heart disease or people who had anemia couldn't get it, uncontrolled hypertension. And we also know that the therapy with interferon caused an awful lot of side effects. More than 30% of the people who were taking interferon of either type had inflammatory reaction, they had a flu-like syndrome, they had headache, they had migraine kind of complications, their platelets went way down, they had muscle aches and pains, and anywhere between 1 and 30% of the people had other kind of issues. They had loss of appetite, they had emotional lability, lack of motivation, diarrhea and depression and diabetes and thyroid disease, and they had altered taste, and their blood count was down. Less than 1% of the people would develop diabetes or eye disease or hearing impairment, or they would develop decreased libido, and they didn't want to take the medicine. So we know that a significant number of people were not candidates for the medicine, and the medicine, if you took it, didn't seem to work all that great. And as a matter of fact, you often would have to take other kind of medicines to get back to normal. If you were taking the interferon, you would have to take some medicines that would stimulate the blood production. You would have to take medicines for diabetes or medicines for cholesterol, because the cholesterol would frequently go crazy. And then we know that on some studies, in other words, one of them called the HALT-C, actually showed that people getting the interferon did worse than the people not getting interferon. So then they developed the direct-acting antiviral drugs. Direct-acting antiviral drugs came into being in 2011. That was a major advance. So these were the drugs that would target those areas. Remember, we talked before about the non-structural proteins of the virus. Well, these would attack those non-structural proteins and then prevent the virus from dividing. So that was very good. That was a simpler treatment. It was a shorter-term treatment. So instead of having to go on for a year, we could frequently do treatment that would last for only about half a year. We know that the likelihood of achieving success wasn't 50%, but now it was somewhere around 90% of the people could eradicate the virus. And we would know that actually in a relatively short period of time. So we could find that in the people getting the direct-acting antiviral drugs, they would show significant improvement, and we couldn't find the virus by about 4 weeks of treatment. So that was very good, and that meant that we could actually discontinue the drug therapy at a relatively early stage. So that's all good. Well, we had two medicines. We had one called Victrellis and the other called Insivec. And those drugs, licensed in 2011, were the talk of the town, the best things going. Now, they're not recommended. It's suggested that you not use either of these drugs. We have those drugs that had significant side effects, and not only significant side effects, but they had complicated methods of treatment. So we know that we could get significant improvement, we could get rid of the virus, but it came at a cost. It came at a cost because there was a lot of interference with the drugs, with other kind of drugs. We know that one of them led to anemia and itching, and 4%, a very severe rash that could be life-threatening, led to nausea and abdominal discomfort and diarrhea and anorectal problems. And we know the other one led to a significant anemia. It caused the red cells and the white cells and the platelets to fall significantly, and it caused a change in the taste. Well, that fortunately, those drugs were on the market for a relatively short period of time before we had some other kind of medicines that came into being. And the next one that came into being was in 2013, a medicine called Olysio. And Olysio was marketed, and it seemed to be relatively good. You would take it for about 12 weeks, but you also would have to take the interferon and the ribavirin. You would have to take that, depending on the kind of hepatitis C you had, what the genotype was, you would have to take that treatment for anywhere between 24 weeks and almost a year. But there was a problem. And the problem is that depending on your particular immune system, your particular chemistry, your particular genetic inheritance, you might not be able to take the drug because it might not work. And then there was a test for that. We could test for the particular type of mutation in your system that would allow the medicine to work or not to work. But then again, we have another problem. Even if it could work, the body frequently became resistant. So we know that these drugs were not terribly good, and we know that even though we're now advancing in the story, Olysio had issues of rash and photosensitivity and itching and a lot of drug interactions. So then we had another kind of medicine, and this medicine is currently used, and it's the darling of some of the pharmacy benefit managers, and it's called the Vicaripac. And the Vicaripac was approved in December of 2014, made by AbbVie, a United States corporation. You have to take 4 pills a day. And when you take this pill, maybe with the ribavirin, maybe without the ribavirin, if you're going to take the ribavirin, you could take as many as 3 pills morning, 3 pills night extra, in addition to the 4 pills you take. The 12-week course of therapy is going to cost somewhere around $80,000 plus. Well, so that was the Vicara that came out in December of 2014. But in between the two, in between the original direct-acting antivirals and the Vicara, we had a significant advance. And the significant advance was a medicine called Sovaldi. Sovaldi came on the market in December of 2013. And this drug has really revolutionized the treatment of hepatitis C. It works against the non-structural proteins that we talked about. You have to take it typically for about 12 or 24 weeks, depending on the kind of hepatitis C you have. The drug would cure somewhere in excess of 90% of the people who took it. It seems that basically, it was the best thing going for hepatitis C. You could treat all of the different kind of hepatitis. And then they came out more recently with another kind of a drug that combined the Sovaldi with another chemical, and it's called Harvoni. And this medicine called Harvoni is now the #1 seller for hepatitis C, and it will cure somewhere between 97 and 99% of the people with the kind of the hepatitis C virus that's present in the United States at the present time. It's the shortest treatment going. You have to take 1 pill a day. You have to take the pill for 12 weeks only. You don't have to take the ribavirin. You don't have to take the interferon. The likelihood of success, as I mentioned, in basically all stages of hepatitis C is somewhere in excess of 95%. Side effects relatively small, maybe a little nausea or vomiting, maybe some diarrhea, headache, or some insomnia. We know that there's another treatment. You could combine the Sovaldi with the medicine that we talked about, the Olesio. There are some side effects that we've just become aware of over the past several weeks that mean that the treatment isn't probably a good idea, but it's still used by some people. Unfortunately, it's associated with rash and photosensitivity and those kind of problems. And it doesn't have the benefits, especially in the people who have somewhat more advanced liver disease. The Vicera pack, well, the Vicera pack can be used. It can be used for 12 weeks if you have no cirrhosis. It can be used for about 24 weeks if you do have cirrhosis, excuse me, with or without the ribavirin. We know that it's pretty successful. It's still about 90-95% successful. If you have the genotype 1A, you might have to take it for a somewhat longer period of time. If you have the genotype 1B, those are the two common kinds here in the United States, well, then you probably only have to take the drug for about 12 weeks. There's issue. There's issue with all of these kinds of hepatitis drugs. The issue is the cost. Now remember, if you have a disease that we have lots of warning about, the overwhelming majority of people who suffer with the virus don't have any symptoms. They don't even know they have the virus. What is an appropriate cost? Well, that's an issue. And it's a very difficult issue to address because Congress is complaining about the cost of the medicine, the World Health Organization complaining about the cost, the private payers are complaining about the cost, patient advocates, we have ethicists complaining about the cost. Sovaldi costs about $1,000 a pill. You have to take a pill a day for 12 weeks, $84,000. The Harvoni costs in excess of $1,100 a day. You have to take that again, 12 weeks. It's going to cost you more than $90,000. If you take the Sovaldi for the $84,000, you have to take some other kind of medicine in addition. If you take the Harvoni, you just have to take the 1 pill a day. It's estimated, at least in the medical literature, it's estimated that the cost to manufacture those drugs is $200 total for the whole course, but they sell it for basically $100,000, $80,000 to $100,000. And at least at the present time, that is an issue. That's a major issue. So much of an issue that 35 states, Medicaid, they have restricted treatment to those people who have more advanced liver disease. Cost of the pegylated interferon and ribavirin, considerably less. Cost of the medicines that we talked about, the first direct-acting antiviral medicines, well, the weekly cost of those medicines, anywhere between $1,100 and $4,100, obviously ridiculous. The cost of Sovaldi, $7,000 a week. Cost of Harvoni, about $8,000 a week or more. We know that since the drugs came on the market, first was Sovaldi in December of 2013. Well, they've treated more than 140,000 patients with hepatitis C. Health system can probably take care of more. Now, The profit for the company, if we look at 2013, the manufacturer of the drug, Gilead Sciences, well, their profit was $3.5 billion, but as of the end of 2014, their profit was in excess of $13 billion selling principally this drug. We have to realize that originally it was said that if we use these kind of treatments that we could reduce the overall burden to society, because after all, the people wouldn't go on to develop chronic hepatitis, they wouldn't go on to develop the cirrhosis of the liver, the decompensated cirrhosis, they wouldn't go on to develop the hepatocellular carcinoma, they wouldn't go on to need liver transplantation. So that would save obviously a significant amount of money, but it was found that we were only spending about $6.5 billion on those sorts of features, but now we're spending a significant amount more. We're spending an additional horrible sum of money, an additional 65 billion at least on our cost of therapy, and we're not getting any of that back. Well, what should we do? What should we do? We have to decide how much our therapy should be given. How many people who have hepatitis C should receive therapy realizing that they're going to go through life perfectly okay as long as they maintain normal weight, they don't drink too much, they don't have any other kind of exacerbating factors. They're not hepatitis B positive, they don't have the AIDS virus. All of these things are quite important. Now we know that Harvoni came on the market only as recently as October of 2014. And when Harvoni came on the market, for the year 2014, it still brought in sales of about $2 billion. Add that to the $10 billion in Sovaldi, and those two drugs together in 2014 amounted to sales of in excess of $12 billion. That put them in second place. In second place as far as the overall cost of medical care. They were the number two drug. Number one drug was Humira. Humira brought in, for the company, $12.5 billion. Well, things have gotten a little bit worse over a period of time. Now there's clamoring for some discounts. Some of the companies are now giving a certain percentage discount to some of the insurers, the pharmacy benefit managers, to some of the other payers, but it's still phenomenally profitable. Just recently, the drug company Gilead brought out its first quarter 2015 earnings for sales. And what they found was that the sales just for a quarter, 3 months, the sales, principally here in the United States, of Sovaldi and Harvoni were $4.55 billion. In other words, the sales just for 3 months were $4,550 million. That money has to come from somewhere. It's not the Fed Reserve. It's actual money that has to be transferred from some insurer to the drug manufacturer. Interestingly, the Harvoni that came in with relatively modest sales, about $2 billion, for the couple months it was on the market in 2014, just in the first 3 months of 2015, the sales of Harvoni were in excess of $3.5 billion, or in other words, $3,580 million worth of sales. Obviously significant. And at the same time, it surpassed Sovaldi sales. Sovaldi fell because why take two drugs when you could take one drug? So now we're down to just one pill. The sales of Sovaldi, 2014, first quarter, in excess of $2.25 billion. This first quarter, 2015, just shy of $1 billion. So all of this, we now have to think, what is happening? The drug company thinks they can make phenomenal amount of money. They thought just a couple months ago that the year's profit would be somewhere around $27 billion, sales, not profit, sales. $27 billion worth of sales of the medicines, principally here in the United States. Now it's thought that, well, they're going to do even better. They're going to make somewhere between 28 billion and 29 billion in sales. And the question is whether treating hepatitis C is really worth about 8%, 7%, 6% of all of the revenues for all of the drugs, for all of the diseases, all of the prescription medicines used here in the United States. I don't have an answer for that, other than to say, boy, these are very expensive medicines. And as a matter of fact, the second drug, the Vicura pack, that sort of is a Johnny-come-lately, but even though it was relatively early in the whole story, well, that's fallen into disfavor. It's not as easy to take. It doesn't have the benefits. So the sales of that drug, in contrast to the multi-billion-dollar sales, well, in the first quarter of Vicura, they couldn't even make $250 million. It was just about $230 billion. And of that, only about $130 billion was here in the United States. So there is no question Harvoni is the #1 drug. As a matter of fact, Harvoni is the most popular drug as far as sales are concerned in the entire world. Question is it worth it? And I don't have the answer. You have to decide. You are the general public. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll be on again next week. Talk about something else. Appreciate your time. I'm Dr. Ken Landa.